Welcome to the third breakout session. This is Sevan Mikkelsen. She is a graduate from the University of Central Florida who holds a Bachelor in Science in Clinical Psychology and a minor in Mass Culture and Collective Behavior. They have lived with hypersomnolence since early adolescence and were diagnosed with idiopathic hypersomnia at the age of 19. What started as a personal interest in the similarities between psychiatric disorders and the hypersomnias grew into a passion, eventually culminating in the completion of an undergraduate honors thesis at UCF. Their work, Co-Occurrence of Autism Spectrum Disorder and Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder with Idiopathic Hypersomnia, data from the Hypersomnia Foundation Registry, we learned about earlier today, is the first study to measure the rates of ASD and ADHD diagnoses in people with idiopathic hypersomnia. Sevan is a lifelong New Englander who grew up in New Hampshire and currently resides in Vermont. Ooh, you were going through every state there. When conscious and caffeinated, they usually can be found photographing and identifying their local wildlife. They enjoy journaling, video games, fast-paced music, and going back to sleep.
Well, first of all, I'm very grateful to have been invited here today by the Hypersomnia Foundation. So I'd really like to say thank you for that. I'd also like to say to everybody who's attending, everyone who's here in the room, everyone who's watching virtually, and anybody who may be watching this from the future, thank you for watching. I'm very happy to be here, and I've got some data. So the introduction covered a lot of it. I'm Sevan, or just Sev. I have idiopathic hypersomnia. So I'm here as a patient in part, but I'm also a researcher.
ADHD and idiopathic hypersomnia overlap.
I did that through the University of Central Florida and their honors undergraduate thesis program. I'm also very grateful to my thesis mentor.
We're just starting if you want to come up and, I'm doing it on my phone, but
the thesis uses data from the Hypersomnia Foundation's Courts Patient Registry to identify self-reported rates of autism and ADHD diagnoses by people with IH. So I'm going to tell you about that study today. And my objectives, the general layout of this presentation is going to be, number one, I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself and how I got to be here today. Number two, I'll give you a little bit of background on autism, ADHD, and sleep, why there's suspicion there, what we know and what we don't, and the results, of course. I'd like to have time to hear from audience and discuss, but we will see about that. If we do not, I will be here for like the entire next week. You contact me online. I would love to talk, but we'll do our best here. So I'm going to start. I suppose that was introduction part one. I'm going to leave this screen here. That is the name of my study and the link to access it if you would like to. Also something to do while I talk about myself. So as it said, like in the intro, it was around the beginning of 8th grade when I was 13 that my symptoms started. And my family did know that something was very clearly wrong. We made many efforts to get me diagnosed, get me help. But despite our best efforts, I went undiagnosed from 8th grade throughout all of high school. After that, I made an unsuccessful attempt to attend college as a full-time in-person student at the University of Central Florida. I did continue with that college, but I had to come back home so I could get diagnosed. And I did get diagnosed when I was 19 years old. It was 6 years between the onset of my symptoms and diagnosis, and it really was through a lot of my very formative years. But I know that a lot of people go actual decades without getting diagnosed. So I feel in some ways unfortunate, even though it wasn't good at all. But the diagnosis did change everything, because up to that point, I really felt like I had been responsible for my own symptoms. Like somehow this was all my fault, that I was tired every single day of my life. So there was the very instant relief of not having to blame myself for that anymore. I'm incredibly, like, quality of life really improved after that. And it's not like treatment eliminated my symptoms. I don't think it does that, but I do feel better. I do feel alive again, and I feel like my life has now actually started. I started doing well in college again. I stayed in New England and did it part-time online for my bachelor's. And it took 8 years because a 4-year program at half pace. But I did do it, and I graduated just last month from UCF with my bachelor's in clinical psychology. Thank you, thank you. So why am I doing this? I think, okay, in some ways, this is very personal for me. I feel like I'm not the only one who's gone through the experience of trying to really tease apart, like, even just autism and ADHD can be very confusing, and the fact that they can exist together. And then with the sleep disorder, it's like, how do we really know which of these indistinct conditions is causing this indistinct symptom? You know, which came first, what's the result, and what's the cause? We don't know any of those things, but I did figure out that I am autistic. I'm very confident in that. And I have IAH. But I've just looked into it a lot to make sure that the self-diagnosing wasn't like completely off base. And it did get confusing after I was diagnosed with IH, because there's some things I'm not really sure which symptoms fit which condition. The experience of brain fog for me, it feels very similar to overstimulation as like autism. I don't know where, it just feels the same a lot of the time. I really cannot tell things apart. I also feel that I have a slower like processing speed, like spoken, and someone speaks to me, I really gotta take a second. But how do I know that that is like a symptom of autism, or if that is a symptom of being tired every day of my life? We just don't know. But this also isn't really about me, because I know I'm not the only person who's felt this way. I did a poll on like the app asking about like who has conditions and who doesn't. I know I'm saying that very gracefully. I was wondering if anybody here has a hypersomnia and a developmental disorder, autism or ADHD. There were a lot of people who are unsure. All right. Yeah, the real reason that I really delved into this is that I know I'm not the only one. I've been in the online spaces for IH, like, honestly, the Idiopathic Hypersomnia subreddit. I've seen a lot of those. But I feel like it's every couple weeks at minimum that someone asks about, like, is there a connection between like ADHD and hypersomnia? And I see it a lot in like one of the group chats I'm in as well. So there was a definite interest. It's been around for a while, and there still wasn't data on it. So decided I could make the data myself. Not like make it, but put it together. My original plan for the thesis was just to do a literature review, like comparing the conditions, what we know in the literature, coincidentally. There really isn't a lot of studies on IH where, like with ADHD and autism, there's a lot of looking at neurological findings and like brain differences, like neurotransmitter differences. There's a lot of data out there on that. There's really barely anything for IH that I found, at least. So that wasn't going to work anyway, but it turns out that the semester that I started in the honors thesis program was the semester that they started requiring psychology majors couldn't do literature reviews. We had to do original data collection. And so I'm out here studying a rare disorder. I have to collect data on it now. So I kind of turned to the only IH data source that I knew of, which is the Hypersomnia Foundation's Co-Occurrence Registry. And I just emailed them. It's like, hey, can I perhaps use your data to find autism and ADHD in IH? And they just said yes. They were like, yeah, sure, that's great. Just get it, do the paperwork through your college, and then you'll be all good. And it was surprisingly simple. They were very receptive to me. Very, very much appreciated. So this is the transition point into the actual data, not just me, not just anecdotally. So the one thing informationally that I'd like to say before we get into these slides is what a lot of this really comes down to is the fact that we have psychological disorders and we have physiological disorders. And autism, ADHD is psychological, and sleep disorders are physiological. And we are finding that some psychological disorders do have very distinct etiologies, physical causes, biological mechanisms. That is true, but that is, turn it back. It's important to understand that psychological diagnoses in general are not based in any physiological component. By definition, they cannot be. They're simply collections of observable symptoms that appear to manifest together and cause dysfunction. So there really isn't that much. It's only like doctor discretion if they really don't feel like diagnosing you with something because you have the other. But other than that, there really isn't anything saying you can't have the symptoms of ADHD. I'm doing this all out of whack, I'm sorry. I had a better statement. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, same set of symptoms. If you have the same set of symptoms, there's little to imply that those symptoms couldn't qualify you for both the hypersomnia disorder and the psychological disorder. So there is not a conflict between those concepts. We just don't know why this is happening and what it actually means. So my mentality with comparing these conditions is that perhaps if we find an overlap between them, we could use the more robust knowledge base of autism and ADHD research to investigate the neurological features of IH. That's the thought process, and that's the hope. All right, we've got slides. Background, developmental disorders. I am assuming that we know what idiopathic hypersomnia is. We don't have all the time in the world. So autism, it's characterized by deficits in social communication, interactions, and restrictive repetitive patterns of behaviors and stress activities. It's estimated about 1% of the global population. It's also about 3% in the United States. ADHD, it's symptoms of inattention and or hyperactivity, impulsivity. interferes with functioning or development. The prevalence rates for that vary significantly more. Might be as low as like 1%, could be as high as 5%. I feel like I've seen a few others that suggest even higher, but we're going with a solid 5% for the present study. We don't have data really on specifically hypersomnia in these conditions, but we do have in general just sleep problems. Sleep disturbances, sleep problems are the same thing. They're just intuitively sleep problems. Sleep disturbances are noted in autistic children at a rate of about like 50% to 93%, using those two estimates there. Prevalence of sleep disturbances in ADHD seems to increase with age. It affects about 40% of children with ADHD, 74% of adolescents, and then 80% of adults. So this is the part of my literature review that is really what I feel I have found from the literature review portion. I feel it's important enough to have to bring it up. The presence of circadian rhythm abnormalities have been found in autism, ADHD, and IA. I did a whole mission to like look at the research for each thing and find which parts overlapped. And the one thing that connected all of them was circadian dysfunction. Out of those, so circadian dysfunction in general, they all share. The list at the bottom is specific types, like what they found specifically. There has been a delayed circadian rhythm or delayed sleep phase syndrome has been noted and documented in IH, autism, and ADHD. And in IH and autism, they found mutations in circadian genes. I believe that with IH, some of them are like associated with more sleepiness. And autism and ADHD share like a weakened circadian rhythm. It's about like sort of the amplitude of how, I don't know how to explain that amplitude eloquently. I guess, say if there's a certain amount of hormones that's like produced in the morning to like help you wake, just is they still have that, but it's not as much of a height as it is in healthy individuals. So the rhythm is there, it's just not like as strong as it should be. Moving forward, what do we know about the developmental disorders in the hypersomnias? These are the prevalence rates that we currently have. I did my study, I had to narrow my scope to something realistic. Studying all the narcolepsies and IH was a bit much for a undergraduate thesis. So I focused on IH, but this is what we had available to us before what I've done. ADHD and narcolepsy has been studied pretty extensively by hypersomnia standards, I suppose. It's just 3 studies. So we have like ranges from 19 to 33%, they estimate, ADHD and narcolepsy, and they use like slightly different metrics. It's not a direct comparison between them, I don't know. The study at the bottom, 25% in narcolepsy, they also broke down into narcolepsy type 1 and type 2. And that suggests that 20% of people with type 1 have ADHD and 46% with type 2 have ADHD. That seems like a pretty significant figure. I would definitely like more research to like confirm that before, but like, that's a bit high, that's a bit suspicious. But my purpose is to fill in the 2 boxes under IH, because we got nothing for IH so far. So you've probably seen the registry before. Something I didn't expect going into this is that the quote section, like the first part of the survey that you take, is not it's a different file than the hypersomnia section. So like if you read the study, it's a lot of just having to deal with working with 2 files. But that's a fun fact. What matters here, we only care about questions 61A and 25. And these are the questions. Please indicate whether any of the following disorders or diagnoses they had in the past, et cetera, et cetera. It just states attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Do you have it? Have you ever been diagnosed? Options, never been diagnosed. We count that as no, you don't have it, naturally. There's diagnosis in the past, but no longer a diagnosis, and current diagnosis. For the study, we considered diagnosed in the past and current diagnosis as being positive. Okay, so they've asked us very beautifully about ADHD on this here page. It is so nice, it's wonderful. They do not ask about autism. There is no question about autism at all whatsoever. So the only option we had was this other diagnosis section from like the cord section at the beginning. And so we just went through and like screened for mentions of autism and saw what was there. It's not an accurate metric of how many people have it, but it's like we have at least this many. This many have told us that they have it. Results, let's go. 2 tests, one of them includes like non-responses. In the case of this, it's very convoluted for autism. Like I decide if they didn't write anything in that text box, then that was a non-response, but that's really arbitrary. Anyway, so if we include just everybody, 0.6% of everybody with IH in the registry reported diagnosis of autism. So 0.6% of everybody in the registry voluntarily offered the fact that they have autism. And again, other figures a little bit convoluted. These are not true prevalence rates. These aren't real figures. They are at least 0.6% of people in the registry. So ADHD, out of everybody in the registry, every single person with IH in the registry, 21.8, so about 22% reported a past or current diagnosis of ADHD. So out of everybody in the registry, 22% have a history of ADHD. And then the exclusion test actually makes sense. Like if they didn't answer the question, we don't involve them in analysis. So out of the people who actually answered that question, it's 25.8%, approximately 26% of people who actually answered that question have a history of ADHD. And because this is an actual solid number, I've broken it down into the current diagnosis and the former diagnosis. 20% approximately have a current diagnosis of ADHD, and 6% have a former diagnosis. Processing. Okay, let's zoom through the end here. This is what the graph looks like now. We have a 22% lifetime rate of ADHD and IH, a 20% rate of a current diagnosis. The ASD is we still have a question mark there because these numbers really don't mean a lot, but let's say at minimum, like 0.6%, maybe even up to 1.6%. But the point is that we definitely need to do research on that to get a solid number because that's not solid. So I am proposing respectfully, but a little desperately as well, if it would be possible to add an autism question to the registry, then we could answer this question very easily. And we could also measure like coexisting autism and ADHD, which isn't possible the way it is now. And honestly, just we need to do all of this again for narcolepsy because we still don't have any figures at all for autism in narcolepsy. With the circadian rhythm abnormalities noted in the conditions, I think it would be interesting to see if people with hypersomnia and ADHD or ASD, if they would have a greater chance of having a circadian rhythm disorder, if there would be like any statistical difference. And then of course, that's just IH and narcolepsy. I feel like I kind of said this before, coexisting autism, ADHD could be measured. And we can measure as well, like narcolepsy type 1 and type 2 with ADHD to see how they compare. We would be able to use the registry to see if there are different patterns in like how the symptom presents in people who have like coexisting conditions, like if there's a different like age of onset or progression, if they have different symptoms, if they tend to use certain treatments, things like that. I would be curious to look into that. I think that
Sevan, thank you so much. I'm
That's
so
all.
impressed with you that you took all of this on. That is amazing. Thank you, Sevan.
Thank you.